Me and my buddy Jake decided to go on a New Year's hike because, honestly, we were sick of the loud parties and chaos in the city. We wanted something quiet, far from people, and spending New Year's Eve by a secluded lake sounded like the perfect plan. The place was pretty remote but still reachable if you were willing to hike a few hours through the woods. We got there late in the afternoon, and it was everything we'd hoped for. Dead silent, a gentle breeze through the trees, and the lake reflecting the sunset like a dream. We set up camp a few feet from the water, joking about making a fire later that night. Everything was peaceful until we heard the scream. It came out of nowhere, loud and piercing, echoing from across the lake. Jake and I froze, looking at each other like, "Did you hear that?" Of course he did. It was impossible not to. It sounded like a woman yelling for help, but we couldn't quite make out the words. We stood there for a few seconds, trying to process it. "We should check it out," Jake said, grabbing his flashlight. It felt weird, but ignoring someone who might be in trouble didn't sit right with us. We quickly put out our fire and followed the shoreline, heading into the trail that looped around the lake. The screams kept coming, almost like they were pulling us deeper into the woods. The further we walked, the darker it got. The only light we had came from our flashlights. For a moment, the screaming stopped, and we thought maybe it was over. But then it started again, even louder this time, sounding more desperate. It was eerie how real it felt, like someone truly terrified. As we kept walking, we spotted something by the edge of the water. A small boat, just sitting there with a paddle leaning against the side. "That's weird," Jake muttered, shining his flashlight on it. There was no one around, but the boat felt off, like it had been left there in a hurry. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps in the woods behind us. The sound of twigs snapping made my chest tighten. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but Jake was already pulling me back. Without thinking, we turned off our flashlights and crouched down in the dark, trying to stay hidden. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet. The steps got closer, and I swear I could hear faint whispers. We stayed frozen, barely breathing, while the sounds seemed to multiply, coming from all directions. After what felt like forever, Jake finally spoke in a shaky voice. "This is a trap. We need to get out of here now." We started backing away slowly, trying not to make a sound, but the dry branches under our feet made it nearly impossible. I felt like we were being watched, and every nerve in my body was screaming to run. Then there was a loud cracking noise deeper in the woods, like a tree branch snapping under something heavy. Jake grabbed my arm, and before I could even react, he took off running. I didn't ask questions. I just followed him. The trail felt endless, and with our flashlights off, it was like running blind. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and Jake's footsteps ahead of me. But every now and then, there was another sound. More footsteps, heavier ones following us. Finally, we stopped to catch our breath when we thought we had put enough distance between us and whatever was back there. Jake pointed toward a faint sliver of moonlight breaking through the trees, signaling the direction of the lake. "If we make it to the lake, we might find our way back," he said, still gasping for air. Just as we started moving again, something made us freeze. Two dark figures appeared in the distance, standing near where we had just been. They didn't move or speak. They just stood there like they were watching. Even though they were far away, I could feel their eyes on us. That was enough to send us running again, faster than before. We ran without stopping, desperately trying to find the lake. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were about to give out, but the fear kept me going. When we finally broke through the trees and reached the shore, we thought we were safe. But then we noticed the boat. It was gone. The same boat we'd seen earlier was no longer there, as if someone had taken it. That sinking realization hit us both at the same time. Whoever was out there wasn't just watching us, they were messing with us. With no boat and no clear way back, we decided to follow the shoreline in hopes of finding the campsite. But the woods seemed different now, darker, and almost alive. Every shadow felt like it was moving, and the quiet was unbearable. Then we heard it again, footsteps fast and heavy, charging toward us. My flashlight started flickering at that exact moment, making everything worse. Jake's light stayed steady, and when he pointed it toward the noise, he froze. I didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of me. Before I could see what it was, the sound stopped, and we realized we had somehow made it back to the main trail. It was like we'd been running in circles. When we realized we were back on the main trail, the panic eased just enough for us to think straight. There were no more sounds behind us, but the silence felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. Jake suggested we head straight for the campsite, grab what we could, and get out of there. At that point, I didn't care about leaving our stuff behind. We just wanted to be as far from that place as possible. The hike back felt slower than it should have, every step weighed down by the feeling that something was still watching us. Even though the trail was familiar, the dark made it feel like we were in completely new territory. Every rustle, every shadow made my heart race. When we finally reached the campsite, we didn't waste any time. We grabbed the essentials and left the tent and supplies behind. But as we turned toward the trail that led out, we both stopped dead in our tracks. Standing at the trailhead were two figures. They were just standing there, completely still, like they'd been waiting for us. My chest tightened as I recognized their silhouettes. They were the same ones we'd seen back in the woods. They didn't move or make a sound, but their presence alone was enough to paralyze us. Jake whispered, "We need to find another way." And without another word, we bolted in the opposite direction, cutting through the woods. Somehow, after what felt like hours of running, we stumbled onto the road where we had parked earlier that day. By some miracle, we got just enough signal on Jake's phone to call a rideshare. While waiting under the dim light of a street lamp, I couldn't stop staring at the tree line, half expecting those figures to step out at any moment. But they never did. When the car finally arrived, we jumped in and didn't say a word until we were miles away from that place. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there. All I know is I'll never go back, and I'll never trust the silence of the woods again. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was December 31st, and all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and spend a quiet evening with my family before the new year. Work had been exhausting that day, and I was just ready to unwind. I parked my car in the garage, went inside, greeted my mom, and headed straight to my room. It wasn't until I got comfortable that I realized I'd left my bag in the car. My phone and a few other important things were in it, so I reluctantly went back out to grab it. It was around 7:30 p.m., and the garage light wasn't as bright as it should have been, but I figured it'd only take a second. As I opened the car door, I heard a noise coming from the backyard. It was subtle, like soft footsteps on the grass. I froze for a moment, thinking maybe it was just a cat or something. But before I could convince myself, I heard the unmistakable sound of the car door on the other side being opened. My blood ran cold. Instinctively, I dropped down, almost hitting the floor, and hid behind a shelf full of tools against the garage wall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever it was could probably hear it. I couldn't stop thinking, who was out there, and why? I could barely breathe. The sound of someone rummaging through the car was clear as day, with objects being shuffled around and tossed aside. Then, I heard a low murmur, like the person was talking to themselves. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was almost angry, like they were frustrated about not finding something. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just some random thief, but there was something about that murmur that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't normal. It sounded agitated, almost desperate. Then the sound changed. I heard something metallic being dragged along the pavement. The noise cut through the silence, making every hair on my body stand up. I couldn't figure out what it was, but it sounded heavy. My mind started racing, imagining the worst possibilities. A chain, a crowbar, or something even worse. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I tried to sneak a peek through a gap between the tools, and all I could make out were shadows moving around the car. At that moment, I knew this wasn't just a regular thief. The metallic sound got closer, like whatever they were dragging was heading straight for the garage. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest, and I forced myself to stay completely still. I couldn't see what it was, but I started imagining all sorts of terrifying things. Then out of nowhere I heard it, this low, muffled laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Whoever this was, they weren't just stealing. They were enjoying whatever they were doing. I gripped the edge of the tool shelf to steady myself, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, the steps moved toward the door that led into the house. My panic went into overdrive as I heard the doorknob twist. I almost screamed, but then came the faint click. It was locked. For a moment, relief washed over me, but that feeling didn't last long. The person began scratching at the door, either with their nails or something metal, as if testing how strong it was. But they didn't try to break it down right away, which made everything worse. It felt like they were taking their time, like they knew someone was nearby and were playing some kind of sick game. Then they went back to the car. I heard the trunk pop open, followed by another long stretch of silence. I couldn't tell what they were doing, but the idea of them finding something in there that could clue them in about me hiding nearby made me feel like I was going to pass out. After a few seconds that felt like hours, the murmuring started again, louder this time, and then came the laughter, this low, eerie chuckle that sent chills through my whole body. At that moment, I couldn't stop thinking, what the hell does this person want? And then, the trunk slammed shut with a loud bang. The dragging sound started again, but this time it was heavier, like they were hauling something big. The noise grew fainter as it moved toward the backyard gate. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely keep myself from falling over. I wanted to run inside, but I was terrified they'd hear me. Instead, I stayed frozen, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Finally, it got quiet again, too quiet, and that silence was somehow more terrifying than any of the sounds I'd heard before. After what felt like forever, I worked up the courage to step out from behind the shelf. My legs were shaky, and every little noise made me flinch. I crept toward the door leading into the house, moving as quietly as I could. Once I got inside, I slammed it shut and locked it behind me, my hands trembling so much I almost dropped the key. I rushed to the living room window, peeking out into the backyard, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The car was still there, but the trunk was wide open and I could see faint marks on the ground, like something heavy had been dragged away. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark backyard, trying to process what had just happened. My family had no idea anything was wrong. They were in the kitchen, laughing and preparing for New Year's Eve like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything to them. What could I even say? That someone had been out there rummaging through my car and dragging who knows what around the yard? To this day, I have no idea who it was, what they were looking for, or what they dragged away. But every time I think about that laughter and those dragging sounds, I feel the same cold dread I felt that night. Whatever happened, it wasn't random. Someone had been there and they knew exactly what they were doing. I've always been the kind of guy who takes on extra rides, especially on holidays when the rates are higher. On New Year's Eve, the town was busier than usual, but it's a small place where most people stick to house parties or local bars. I was already tired and about to call it a night when a ride request popped up nearby. The destination was a residential neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. I figured it would be my last ride before heading home. When I arrived at the pickup point, I saw a guy standing on the sidewalk, hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. He got in without saying much, just a muffled, "Good evening." At first, everything seemed normal, but as we got going, he asked to change the destination, saying he needed to pick something up on the way. It wasn't unusual for people to change their drop-off, so I agreed. That's when I started noticing his behavior. He kept holding his jacket in a weird way, like he was hiding something underneath. I tried to brush it off, but the whole vibe was starting to feel off. Then he asked if I was working all night and if I lived around here. I kept my answers vague, but every question he asked made my heart race a little more. The way he stared at me through the rearview mirror was unsettling. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was running wild with all kinds of thoughts. Then he asked something that made my stomach drop. "Does anyone know you picked up this ride?" My voice almost gave out, but I managed to reply, "Yeah, the app tracks everything." He didn't say anything after that, just gave me this strange smirk like he was thinking something over. The route started shifting to a less populated area, and the tension in the car was almost suffocating. He pointed to a side road, saying it was a shortcut to where he needed to go. It didn't feel right, but for some reason, I went along with it. My GPS kept insisting the original destination was in another direction. That's when I noticed him gripping his jacket tighter, adjusting his posture like he was on edge. At that point, I knew for sure something was wrong. As we drove down that empty road, the silence was deafening. No houses, no other cars, just the sound of the engine and his heavy breathing. My hands were sweating on the wheel, but I kept it together as best I could. Then he asked something that sent a chill down my spine. "Do you have family?" I gave him a short yeah. He paused for a moment, then followed up with, "So, is anyone waiting for you at home tonight?" My stomach sank. I lied, replying, "Yes," hoping it would shut him up. The route kept getting darker and quieter, and my nerves were shot. He told me to stop the car, saying this was the place where he needed to get out. There was nothing there, just trees and an open field. When I looked at him, he had his hand inside his jacket holding something bulky. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. I told him I couldn't stop there because it wasn't safe, but he insisted, his voice firm and almost commanding. I knew stopping in that spot wasn't an option. I needed to think fast. I told him there was a problem with the car, pretending the engine light had come on. "I gotta check this out," I said, trying to sound annoyed rather than terrified. I pulled over to the side of the road and jumped out, acting like I was inspecting the engine. My heart was racing and my mind was screaming at me to come up with a plan. I glanced back and saw him stepping out of the car, but he didn't come any closer. He just stood there gripping his jacket and staring at me. That's when instinct kicked in. Without a second thought, I bolted down the road, running as fast as I could. I didn't even know where I was going, just away from him. I could hear his footsteps behind me getting faster. Then he shouted, "Hey, come back, don't do this!" His voice was oddly calm, but had this threatening undertone that made my blood run cold. I pushed my legs harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs, and glanced back just once. That's when I saw it, a flash of something shiny under his jacket. It looked like a knife. I kept running, my chest burning and my legs feeling like they'd give out at any second. There was nowhere to go but down that deserted road, so I pushed forward, hoping to find anything. A house, a car, even a sign of life. His footsteps were right behind me, and I swear I could feel his presence closing in. Then, just ahead, I spotted a curve in the road surrounded by thicker trees. Without thinking, I dove into the bushes and hid behind a fallen tree trunk, trying to catch my breath without making a sound. The crunching of leaves under his boots was unbearable. He slowed down, and I could hear him muttering something, though I couldn't make out the words. He was close, way too close. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice low and unnervingly calm. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, hoping the darkness and the thick brush would be enough to keep me hidden. He wandered around for what felt like an eternity, his footsteps circling nearby. Then suddenly, they stopped. I peeked out from behind the trunk, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. He was standing back near the road, looking around like he was still deciding what to do. Then, just as abruptly as it all started, he turned and walked away. I watched as he headed toward my car, his hands still clutching whatever was hidden under that jacket. I stayed frozen, waiting until I couldn't hear him anymore before daring to move. When I finally felt safe enough to come out, I ran back toward the road in the opposite direction of my car. It took me what felt like hours to flag down a passing car, but eventually someone stopped and called the cops for me. I never went back for the car that night. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in silence, replaying everything in my head. To this day, I have no idea what he was planning or what he had under that jacket, but I'm sure of one thing: if I hadn't acted when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. I knew the trip was going to be rough because of the weather, but I didn't think it would get this bad. It was New Year's Eve, and a snowstorm was taking over the road. The visibility was terrible, and my windshield wipers could barely keep up with the ice building up. I decided to stop at the next gas station I could find, mostly to stretch my legs and avoid crashing. When I finally saw the glowing sign in the distance, I felt a moment of relief. It was one of those old, isolated gas stations, the kind you wouldn't see another person near for miles. But in that moment, it seemed like my only option. I parked near the entrance, turned off the engine, and went inside to grab some coffee. There was this weird silence, like the snow and wind had muffled everything. The cashier barely looked up from the counter when I walked in, but I didn't think much of it. I grabbed my coffee, paid quickly, and headed back to my car. That's when I noticed something, or rather someone, that wasn't there before. A man in a heavy jacket and hood was standing by my car. He was staring right at me, but the smile he gave looked off. Without any small talk, he asked if he could hitch a ride. Said the storm had caught him off guard. Something about the way he spoke made me hesitate. It wasn't the request itself. It was how he said it, so calm, like he wasn't bothered by the storm at all. My first instinct was to make up an excuse, something that wouldn't make things awkward, but also wouldn't commit me to helping. I told him I wasn't going very far, just waiting out the storm a bit. He tilted his head, like he was sizing me up, trying to figure out if I was lying. He didn't reply right away, which only made me more uneasy. After a few seconds, he just smiled again, this time showing his teeth, and said, "All right, but think about it. You never know who might really need a hand." That sent chills down my spine, but I forced a nod, got into my car, and locked the doors almost instantly. When I started the engine and checked my rearview mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A second man, someone I hadn't noticed before, was standing on the other side of the lot, half hidden behind a gas pump. He wasn't moving, just watching. My chest tightened. It was like they were waiting for something, trying to corner me. The man by my car still hadn't left. He leaned closer, trying to peer through the window, while I debated what to do. The idea of driving back onto the icy road was terrifying, but staying there felt way worse. I took a deep breath and put the car in gear, not caring if I looked rude or panicked. The man next to my car stepped back like he wasn't expecting me to leave so suddenly. When I glanced at him one last time, his smile was gone, replaced by this look of anger or maybe frustration. I didn't stick around to figure it out. As soon as I pulled far enough away, I checked my rearview mirror again and saw the two men walking toward where my car had been parked. They were gesturing at each other, like they were arguing. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. It wasn't just fear. It was the sinking realization that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. Driving in those conditions was almost impossible. The road was blanketed in snow and ice, and the wind kept pushing the car from side to side. I was terrified of skidding off the road, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that gas station. That feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror every couple of seconds, half expecting to see one of their cars following me. That's when I decided to call the police. I told them everything: the two men, what they looked like, and the location of the gas station. The dispatcher sounded calm, but told me not to go back there and to head to the nearest town to wait for a patrol car. That only made me more nervous. The fact that someone else thought the situation was dangerous confirmed my fears. When I finally hit a part of the road with decent cell service, I got a call back from the police. They said a patrol car was already on its way to the gas station, and I should keep heading somewhere safe. That gave me a small sense of relief, but it also made me feel weirdly responsible. What if those guys tried something with someone else? Even though the storm was making everything harder, I kept driving until I found a small diner off the highway. I pulled in, ordered another coffee, and sat by the window, keeping an eye on the road outside. About an hour later, the police called me again. The officer explained they had arrived at the gas station and spoken to the staff. To my surprise, the employees claimed they hadn't seen anyone matching the description of the two men. They said the place had been almost empty all night, except for me. When I asked about security cameras, the officer said they weren't working because of the storm. My stomach sank. It was like the whole thing had only happened in my head, but I knew it didn't. I could still see the man's unsettling smile and feel the cold snow on my face when I'd locked eyes with the other one behind the gas pump. I stayed in the diner a little longer, trying to process what had happened. I started questioning myself. Did I really see those two men? Maybe the fear and stress from the storm had warped my perception, but every detail was still sharp in my mind. The strange calmness in the man's voice, that unsettling smile, and the way the other guy stood so still, like he was waiting for the perfect moment. Eventually, I got back in my car and continued driving, but every passing car made me jump, like I was expecting someone to follow me. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've never stopped at that gas station again, and I avoid driving alone in bad weather whenever I can. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd hesitated just a little longer. Or worse, if I'd agreed to give that man a ride. Something about the whole situation didn't feel right, and I'm just thankful I got out of there when I did. The fact that the staff didn't see anything only makes it creepier. I try to move on, but every time I see an isolated gas station, I can't help but remember that night. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work, and never miss the next ones. Thank you.